Thanks very much. Can you hear me all right down the back? Yep, very good. Okay, thanks Robert for the introduction. So, yep, we're going to talk about these serogroup specific vaccines. And the reason we're using these now is because the old 10 strain vaccine is no longer available. So, and plus they have to have a good place anyway. So, this is a photo of the Footrot bacterium, and the reason I put that up here is to show you this wild hairstyle that this bacterium sports, and the importance of that is that on those little hairs are particular proteins that are specific in what we call the serogroup, and the sheep reacts to those proteins and produces antibodies, and those antibodies match the bacterium and kill that particular serogroup of the bacterium off. So we've got to produce the right antibodies for each sort of serogroup. And in the old 10 strain, of course, they combined all of the 10 serogroups. Now the serogroups run from A through to I, and then whoever named them missed a couple of sessions of Sesame Street and went to M. So M strain is quite rare. There's a little problem in there in that a lot of the PCR testing doesn't cover the M. So it's something you've got to keep in mind, that if there's a breakdown, it could be because M hasn't been included. Now these serotypes we don't think are that important, though I know with the old 10 strain, the B4 serotype could sometimes be important. So that's the basis of the vaccine. Now we know that the body can only do so much, and if you give it 10 serogroups to work on, it will only produce about that much. The blue line there is a multivalent. That's a 9 serogroup vaccine. It can only produce so much antibody against each of those serogroups. You give the body 2 to work on, and it can do a much better job on those and gets a much higher level of antibodies, and those antibodies will hang around above what we call the protective level. That dotted line there is a protective level, and those antibodies will hang around for a lot longer and then peel off over time. So from field experience, I think it's probably actually a bit more than 6 months protection. So we can get a lot higher, better cure rates and a longer period of protection by using the serogroup specific vaccines. So the other term I'll use is the word strain. Now when I talk about strain, I'm going to talk about virulence. So you can have a benign strain, you can have a virulent strain, and the important thing is that you can have a particular serogroup. You can have serogroup A, and it can have both a benign and a virulent serogroup A in the one flock, sometimes in the 1 foot. So you've just got to be aware of the difference between strain and serogroup, and the importance, because we believe these vaccines only work best against the virulent strains, then the virulence of what you've got on your properties is just as important as the serogroup. So why use serogroup specific vaccines? Well, A, the 10 strain no longer available. We get this long period of protection. We're getting good cure rates. We had one property in Tassie that took the chronics, the badly affected sheep at their summer inspections, and they treated those and cured 90% of them. So they were pretty happy with that. We can protect the ewes. We're vaccinating ewes now, and that immunity will take them through this winter, through next spring, and we expect to do the eradication inspections next summer. And generally, if everything works right, and we get all the serogroups in the vaccine and everything works correctly, then we can get the culling rate at summer inspections down to less than 5%, which for most people is doable. And we don't muck around with hospital mobs. If they're positive after vaccination, if they've still got foot rot at that summer inspection, they're straight on the truck and straight down to the abattoir. And we don't muck around with hospital mobs or anything like that. So we've been using it so far as an eradication aid. I do have some properties that are interested in using it as a control, and it'll be interesting down the track to see how they go. The other good thing is that there's no withholding period. You can use long-acting oxytetracyclines in summer to eradicate, to cure clinical cases. The downside of that is you've got to manage that really well. You've got to keep your sheep on slatted floors after you treat them. You only treat the ones you've got it. You've got to keep them on slatted floors for 24 hours. Then you've got to put them in a dry paddock. Can't get wet feet for a month until you can get at them and cull out the non-responders. But then usually those withholding periods 42 days, so often it's another month before you can unload those sheep as well. There's no withholding period with the foot rot vaccine. So deciding whether to use it or not, first thing is the strain virulent enough? We can't guarantee it's going to work against the benign or the intermediate strains. So, it's probably not economic to, if you've only got mild scald and only comes up on wet years, it's probably economically not worth getting rid of. So, and then of course the other basics, if you eradicate foot rot, you don't want to get it back in, so you've got to make sure you've got secure boundaries and all those sorts of things. You've got to make sure you can get clean musters. Make sure that you're not introducing other sheep all the time that could sort of muck up your program. And most people introduce rams, that's fine. You can run a pretty good introduction program on rams to make sure that they're not infected. But yeah, you just need to think it all through. You're not going to get reinfected, and you've also got to think about eradication itself. If your aim is to invest in the vaccine to eradicate, then you've got to make sure all your facilities are right, your handling facilities, and you've got enough skilled personnel or access to good contractors, and you've got to have enough time and money. And a lot of farms these days are pretty busy, and you've got short windows where they're not cropping or taking off a crop or doing something else. So you've got to make sure that it all works. Incidentally, the presence of cattle and deer should not discourage you from having a crack at eradication. We've got fallow deer running all over Tasmania, and we've eradicated on a number of properties without any problem. But feral goats can be a problem. They'll certainly carry virulent foot rot. Then you've got to work out, is it cost effective to eradicate that foot rot? Now I won't go into the details. Got some handout sheets there if you're really interested. AWI have a link, have a website, and there's links to a calculator. You can plug in your own values and you can work out whether it's going to pay you on your property to eradicate foot rot. So you need to do that exercise and make sure that it's going to pay. Now, then you've made those decisions and you've decided, okay, I think it's going to pay. So the next sample is to do your testing. So you've got to get some sampling done. We recommend you use your veterinarian. You're going to have veterinary approval to get your vaccine from the vaccine manufacturer. So you might as well get your vet involved at that stage. So we recommend doing it when it's actively spreading, that you, or just after spread. So what we're trying to do there is to make sure we get all of the serogroups, and even the intermediate ones or the less virulent ones can be important in that if you have someone who, if you have your flock tested and you find out only the virulent strains, saying you're testing late summer, you might miss the intermediate strains, then you might be disappointed if you have an intermediate strain with a serogroup that's not in the vaccine and that's still there afterwards. And we're always paranoid about missing a serogroup, and a newly introduced serogroup is a risk. So often, even though they're not easy to handle, I like to sample rams if I can, or the ewe groups where mixed age ewe groups which have been all over the property and things like that. Sometimes you might introduce mobs or mobs along boundaries if you thought they might be more at risk of having a recent introduction of a new serogroup. So we tend to go for the worst feet and just swab the score 5s if possible, and and that's what we end up doing is trying to get a swab from the really active areas. We try and get the swab in under, we don't want too much poo and dirt on it and mud and stuff, but it doesn't matter if you get a bit. We're trying to get good fresh swabs, put them in a little jar of the transport media, and there's two types. One where we use what we call the PCR, which is a rapid test, another sort that we can use to do the conventional bacteriology where we grow the bugs up and do a bit more virulence testing before we proceed. So if we're not sure about the virulence, we'll often take the cultures, try and grow the bug on the agar plates. Then we do what we call the elastase test. You can see these little flecks of hoof agar. We just grind up sheep's feet, put them in the agar plates, and that helps the bugs grow. And that's the colonies of the foot rot we've just smeared down the plate. And when it clears, you can see how those little flecks have disappeared down those next to there. That's what we call a clearing of the elastase, and that can happen at 4, 8, 12, etc. days. And we go for the virulent strains. We're not too worried about the benign strains as far as serogrouping is concerned. So the other way is, and we often do it at the same time, is to take a swab into a little bit of clear fluid in a tiny little vial, and that goes into a machine, which I won't tell you about the science of it, but it basically can tell us the serogroups very quickly. And if we're really confident about the virulence of the strain, sometimes we just take the swabs from the score 5 sheep and send them just for the PCR, and that will give us a result which only costs about $1,100 and can tell us everything we need to know. So that's basically the two ways. That STM just means Stewart's Transport Media, which means for the conventional bacteriology. If we know it's virulent, then if the PCR comes out quite early, and we know that we've only got 1 or 2 serogroups there, then we just tend to stop doing the culturing, which is expensive, and away we go. So, but there's other procedures there. If we, go through and we determine that yes, there's only 2 virulent strains, and the other 2 virulent serogroups, and the other serogroups are benign, then we can still go with a vaccine. So there's a bit of a process to work through there. Then we get to interpreting the results, and we take, depending which way we've gone with all this, if we went with the culturing and the elastase test, then we can look at what the serogrouping results are and what the elastase results are. And with this one, you'll find that the H strain is only a 16-day, which puts it in the intermediate stage, but we're still worth trying to get rid of. So on that particular property, we're using a bivalent H and I serogroup vaccine. And so it just depends. Some properties you get up there, you'll find you've got 3 virulent serogroups, and then they have to decide whether to do 2 rounds of vaccination. So the vaccine, now you're deciding about whether to go or not, then you've got to think about the costs. So the virulent, if you've got 1 virulent serogroup, vaccine's $1.18. 2 virulent serogroups, $2.12 per dose. And of course you've got to do 2 shots 4 to 6 weeks apart. So that's going to double that. Plus of course your labour, all those sorts of things. And of course you've still got to do the conventional eradication, if that's your aim. You can use it as a control if you want to, but we haven't done much of that, so we don't really know how that works. But if you want to eradicate, then you've got to think through the process of eradication and what it will cost you, and whether it's practical. So we do it 2 ways in Tassie. We vaccinate either about now, just before we put ewes out to lamb, because we're mainly spring lambers, and that immunity will carry through lambing, through spring, and take them through to next summer, when we will normally, after weaning, we'll start tipping them and foot pairing them and diagnosing and eradicating. So your vet has to authorise the supply of the vaccine, and it usually takes about 2 weeks. The vaccine's already made, it's sitting there in single serogroup batches, but they have to mix it together and still end up with a 1 ml dose. So there's a little bit of mucking around in the lab to produce your vaccine. So they need a couple of weeks warning. And the other thing is, don't expect too many cures after the first shot. We've found that it's at least a week after the second vaccination before those chronically affected sheep will really start to dry up and look good. So the normal eradication, it's all right, yep. Normal eradication things, first inspection, subsequent inspections are quicker. We recommend, sort of not ending up with a bloodbath at that stage, because the blood sort of tends to obscure what you need to see. And anything that looks doubtful, we tend to say, look, if you can't decide whether it's the toe of the foot, whether it's an old toe abscess or whether it's a bit of, a little sort of carrier state foot rot, get rid of it. Just get rid of it. It's just not worth the effort or the risk. We don't have hospital mobs or suspect mobs. We just we just go in there. We've used a vaccine. It's usually less than 5% affected. We just cull them, mark them clearly, and they just on the truck off to the abattoir as soon as we can get them off the place. And we don't, if it's a true non-spread period, we don't tie ourselves in knots about bringing sheep in and taking them out over the same laneways and yards and things. But just if it's true non-spread period, that doesn't matter. And because you've got the vaccine in them as well, so that, you shouldn't get breakdowns. So that simplifies the programs, and very often we don't vaccinate the cull ewes or the prime lambs. We just keep them really, really well identified and really, really out of the way. We aim for at least 2 inspections, ideally 2 clean inspections, but very often you'll find that you're throwing out a couple of not sures in those. You can never be 100% sure you've had a clean inspection, but the important thing is to do the best you can. And in smaller flocks, we've even done it with a single inspection and culling and come out the other side with an eradication. So it's a matter of doing the best that you can manage. And then after that, the surveillance stage is important, and if you do it right, if you do have a breakdown in a particular mob, you can limit it to that breakdown mob, and you don't have to go back right through the whole lot. So it's a matter of just keeping flocks, when it's back into spread period, keeping flocks separate as much as possible. Anything you see lame, pounce on it, look at it, mark it. If it's only foot abscess or something, just put a spray mark on it so you don't look at it again, and just be ready for a breakdown. And surveillance goes on forever. Once you've eradicated, you've got to be on the ball and pick things up quickly if you do get a breakdown anywhere. Then the prevention phase, once you've eradicated, of course, then you've got to keep it out. So, and you've got to think about everything, everything that comes on, sheep and goats, potties, strays, loans, agistment, everything. Use your sheep health statement. Doesn't matter, even if the rams are from a very trusted breeder, tip them up and look at them and pair them when you get them home. Don't take anyone's. A lot of people will get denial when they get foot rot, and they'll tell you that they haven't got it, and they believe they haven't got it, but they've got it. So you've got to do your own checking and isolate them and challenge them once you've got them home. Some people reckon that foot rot won't survive in really alkaline soils, but I wouldn't trust that. I think it's more to do with how wet it is, how long the grass is, and your susceptible species, and of course you've got to have the right bug there. So it's the sort of sheep you run, and it's also the sort of country you run them on, and it's also having the bug there. So there's a combination of factors. I don't think anyone's proved soil type to be, the New Zealanders reckon that there's some alkaline soils. If you send them across to the west coast of South Island, the foot rot will disappear. I've never seen anything really scientific about that at all. Yeah, yep. You can certainly select for foot rot resistance, and it's about hereditary is about 0.2, which is as good as micron and fleece weight. And we've got flocks in Tasmania, which we've got one bloke down at Bothwell who's been selecting against it for 20 years, and he's made a lot of progress. And you'll never see anything. We know he's got a really good virulent strains, but you'll never see anything worse than about a score 2 or 3 on his property. But it's a 20-year time frame, and while you're selecting for that, you're not selecting for the other production characteristics. You'll also see that there's a gene marker test that's available from New Zealand, and it looks at, there's a particular bunch of genes which are sort of involved with immunity that it looks at, but it's not terribly effective either. We looked at a flock of Dooney rams a little while ago, and the ram that had the best score had score 5 foot rot. So you could have selected that ram as put him in an AI program based on his gene marker score, and you could have wrecked your whole flock. So it's a difficult area. I just feel that if the amount of time and effort and mucking about and costs and everything and the inaccuracies there, if I could eradicate, I would always eradicate. Yeah. About 50% of our flocks will have 2 serogroups or less, and I think you said about 60% of yours.
Small sample in Victoria.
Yeah, small sample. But it's interesting because we've had Sydney Uni take 40 samples from a flock, and you'll find that there's a lot of this particular flock had 4 different virulent serogroups in it, but I think there were 2 sheep with one of the serogroups. Now, if we'd used the vaccine on the others and wiped them out, then that serogroup would have probably taken over. So there's always a risk there, and it's a balance between the cost and the chances of finding all the serogroups. But if we only take 10 samples, there's a chance we might miss some. And I encourage people to use the vaccine on a mob of chronics first, and if you don't get at least a 90% cure rate, then maybe consider then sampling the ones that haven't responded, because that's going to be the serogroups not covered by the vaccine. So that's sort of like a double check. Or just use them on, one bloke said, I'll just use, he's got his worst mob of ewes. He had 500 ewes, and he just used the vaccine on them, and he rang the other day and said, I've got no lame sheep in that mob. So now he feels confident. He's bought vaccine for the rest of his flock. So that's the thing that we always worry about, is missing a virulent serogroup. But and you can have up to 7. We have properties with up to 7. So, well, your choices are to do 2 serogroups, 90 days later, start another 2 serogroups, 90 days later, start another 2 serogroups, and then hopefully plan it all so that then you hit your summer period and you're trying to eradicate them. So that's just what Sydney University recommends. Yeah, so it's still doable, but and we've got one bloke on King Island who's had 7, started off with 7 serogroups, and he's gone and and he said his foot rot's still there, but he's it's pretty mild, and he thinks he's got rid of the really bad serogroups and the really bad strain. I think if I had tipped them all and I found no sign of foot rot, if I'd examined those, inspected those feet thoroughly, they've been through a challenge period, nothing had popped up, I would, but I wouldn't do it immediately after just having done the inspections. I would like to see them challenged first before I actually said they were foot rot free.
So the following summer?
Yeah, I would put them through a good spring before I was really confident. But I think once, if you've consistently had outbreaks every spring, you do your eradication, and the next spring you don't have any breakdowns, I would feel pretty confident, yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's the thing with, if you're using a sheep health declaration, there's a section there, I think, where you can add a few details, and that's what I would do. I'd tell people exactly what I've done and exactly what I've found, and then that's their choice, and you've fully informed them about the status of your animals and done the right thing. Look, heaps of people have eradicated using long-acting oxytetracyclines. I think it's one of the main things that you weigh up, and you think, if I can use, I don't know, what would a shot of Oxitec costs these days, I'm not sure. But, you know, say I spent $2 on per sheep with Oxitec, and I cured 90% of the affected sheep, and I eradicated, and I compared that to the cost of testing and say a bivalent vaccine, or if I had multi-strains, you know, I'd be looking towards, I'd give the Oxitec a shot first. If you just find it's not, you know, you're using it and it's not working, you're still getting breakdowns, then maybe then go to the vaccine.
Authorised by Victorian Government, 1 Treasury Place, Melbourne.